social emotional learning, trauma-informed teaching, and art integration. A little bit about me. I am currently a faculty, adjunct faculty for two wonderful universities, Cal State University as well as Alder University. And I am also a, a K through 12 teacher on special assignment with the Oakland Unified School District. I have an incredible position with Sojourner Truth School, which is the only virtual school in Oakland Unified. So we work with a population of young people who are have been less successful in the traditional brick and mortar environment, but it's a wide range of wonderful young people within our community at SJT. And I've been with SJT for about 3 years now, and I was 18 years at Skyline High School in Oakland Unified. So I'm very much immersed within the community as teacher as well as adjunct faculty and committed to the work of inclusion. Mm-hmm. To ground our conversation in social emotional learning and trauma-informed practices and art integration, it's always great to just remind ourselves of the 5 social emotional learning competencies that we are familiar with everyone on the call. If you're not, they are here on this chart. They are self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision making. And these 5 competencies have been immersed within our educational system now for several years. In fact, I remember over 20 years ago at Oakland Unified, for instance, I was a part of the committee that was developing these practices for Oakland Unified and integrating them across K through 12 environments within our classrooms. So while we were supporting students academically, it was very clear that we also benefited from having what we call a practice of social emotional learning, so that we are recognizing that our students do not learn in an academic vacuum, right? They are the whole child is considered when we think about all of the social and emotional components and variables that are attached to learning, as we all know here on this call. So just to kind of ground ourselves in that understanding of what the social emotional competencies are, which is self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision making. And if I could just orient your attention to how these skills are definitely focused on the student level, because that is at the core of our conversation together. Okay. So in my work, 20 plus years with students, definitely am committed to social emotional learning. As I said, I was a part of the committee at Oakland Unified. And over the years, it has become clear to me that just like everything in education, we benefit from continuing to explore how to expand and to continue to develop our understanding of learning practices and cognition and brain science and psychology. So it has occurred to me over the last several years that how is it that we could perhaps expand our understanding of social emotional learning? Some of the reason why that thought came to me, or as should I say, I was intrigued by this exploration, is I have become throughout my career trained as a trauma-informed specialist, okay? And so I also have a background in behavioral science, and I was discovering that a lot of the social emotional learning competencies that we have are very much focused on the student, okay? And as a trauma-informed specialist, I started to wonder and explore, what is the impact of trauma within our school districts, and how does this overlap or integrate with our social emotional learning practices? So as we know, social emotional learning has traditionally focused on the five competencies as individual skills for our learners. And today we will explore expanding social emotional learning to include a more ecologically integration of learning from the perspective of definitely the individual, but also a contextual understanding and a societal understanding of what social emotional learning means in our classroom. So what does all that mean? I'm considering, or I invite us to consider that supporting meaningful and effective social emotional learning, or in other words, self-regulated learning, invites us to expand into the view to consider, how is learning happening? How is learning happening? So we definitely want to promote and support students to develop the five competencies of social emotional learning, but we also want to have a learning environment that is rich in understanding of how the learning is actually happening, not only just for our teachers, but also for our students as well and our administrators. Because learning is an embodied relational experience that is situated in systems. And it is quite beneficial for our teachers to have an understanding of how the learning is embodied, which drives attention and memory, how learning is relational, it shapes engagement and identity, and how learning is situated in systems, conditions, access, outcomes. And we're going to explore a little bit more about what that means. Okay. In a reframing of social emotional learning, in this more integrated approach, we're considering trauma-informed practices because they respond to context, adversity, and systemic impact for our learners. We're considering art integration, which another word is for that is neuroaesthetics, which activates embodied engagement, and relational frame theory, which we'll explore more what that means in the discussion, which constructs meaning through language. This perspective invites a more comprehensive approach to social emotional learning that really gets into a deeper discussion beyond the five competencies to really understand ecologically what's occurring in the learning process. Mm-hmm. So as a foundation for us to understand what's occurring within the learning process, it's very important for us to have a bit of understanding about our memory systems, because we're going to talk a bit about how learning happens. Okay. So how does learning happen? How does it become memory, this information that we're sharing with our students? And is it learning if information is not processed into memory? That's just something to ponder. Okay. So we're in an environment where we're presenting a lot of curriculum and a lot of information to our students. The understanding is that they will comprehend the information, commit it to memory, and then we have the learning process. So for us to understand this memory process is very important for us to be able to engage in learning. Okay. So as foundational, let's do a little bit of understanding of how memory occurs and the impact, or should I say, the relationship between memory and learning. So the major memory systems and their roles in learning are four major roles, okay? We have in the brain science, and we're not going to go into the brain science, but just for our sake as educators, a very foundational understanding is we have systems of memory that are working in our brains, in all of our learners' brains. We have what we call working memory. You may already be familiar with some of this information. So if so, it's a reminder. And if it's new, We're not going to go too in depth into the brain science of it, but we are going to have a foundational understanding for us as educators. Okay. So we have memory systems that are functioning in all of our brains, and there's four major systems that impact the learning process. It's what we call our working memory, which holds and processes information. We have episodic memory, which is its role in learning is experience and emotion. We have semantic memory systems, which role in learning is concepts and language. You could hear semantics with language. And then we have procedural learning systems, which is focused on skills and automaticity. So the how our brains are designed is these working memory systems, these memory systems, working, episodic, semantic, and procedural, are all engaging in the learning process in these particular focuses. Okay. And they're all important for us to understand as we are engaging in the learning process. It's also important for us to understand how memory and emotion work together for the learning process. So we have these memory systems that are very much impacted by emotion. Emotion drives memory. Okay. Emotion directs our attention and it strengthens memory. This is very important in the concept of learning. Okay. Because in essence, what's occurring is as we're having events in our life, which is inclusive of learning and being exposed to curriculum as well as social experiences in school, these events are processed, okay, as emotional events in the amygdala. They have emotional significance. So when we're in school, when we're in a learning process, and we're having events that are committed to memory, the events that are particularly emotionally salient become very committed to memory. Emotionally meaningful experiences are more likely to be retained because they have been flagged by the amygdala and the hippocampus as important information for us to remember for our lives moving forward. This happens in life. It's not just a school setting. This is just the design of how memory and emotion are interrelated when it comes to engagement in life and the learning process. So it's important for us to understand that. And we know this because this is a lived experience that we have as human beings, that when we are in a highly emotional setting, we tend to remember those experiences more significantly than we do less so. That doesn't mean that we don't remember non-emotional experiences that are less emotionally salient, but we do have a tendency to attach meaning to the more emotionally salient experiences. So that's important for us to remember when it comes to learning, that our memory, we need to be focused on how memory is occurring and how emotion is occurring. Okay. So emotion, salience, and learning process. Here's a chart that we can review that just explains how emotion strengthens memory, and some supportive practice of that is we can use story and connection when we're engaged within the learning process for students to have a highly emotional experience in the school environment, and it will stick to memory. We've seen this happen all the time in our school settings. Okay. Experience, as we say, okay, impacts learning because as we have more and more events and experiences with life and with learning, it grows our repertoire of experiences and a way of engaging in a supportive practice with this is to have active engagement for our learners to be having many different as many as possible active engagements with the curriculum. Because as they're actively engaging with these events and they're committed to the process, they are also having emotional experiences that are strengthening the memory. Okay. Another brain function called the reticular activating system, which is a bundle of nerves that is within our brain stem that actually helps to focus the attention in a particular way to make learning even more meaningful. So each individual person, each individual student, okay, will have experiences that are unique to them, and their reticular activating system, their ROS, will filter their attention in those particular ways. So hopefully what we're understanding here is that when we're walking into the school setting, there's many processes that are occurring within our brains, right? Within our learning systems and structures that are happening. They are activating emotional signals in the amygdala, in the hippocampus. When the emotions are significant, they are stored and remembered, and that is the learning process. Okay. Trauma, okay, disrupts this process because a learner can become hyper vigilant in terms of their attention. So their reticular activating system, which may be focusing on a particular event or experience in learning, becomes hijacked, and they become hyper vigilant because now we're becoming particularly attuned to whether or not there's safety in the environment. So the attention is still there, but it becomes hyper vigilant, the attention. So in the classroom environment, the way how the emotionally salient experiences occur, particularly within trauma, is that emotion, as we know, drives attention and memory because learning is biologically coded through this experience. Trauma disrupts the learning because the student can become hyper vigilant, which is hyper attentive, or they can shut down and become dysregulated, and there's reduced executive functioning. So definitely within the functional school environment, we want the learner to be engaged, we want them to be interested, we want them to be emotionally captivated because it strengthens the memory. And in a traumatic event, there's still a heightened level of emotion, which will definitely still be remembered because it's heightened emotion, but it's the emotion that can shut a learner down and they could become hyper vigilant. So hopefully what we're understanding is how significant emotion is within the learning process. Okay. Okay. So trauma does disrupt learning. Okay. Traumatic event does make the learner hyper vigilant and shut down because we're all familiar with the fight, flight, or freeze process. The way to manage that would be to have predictable routines, okay, so that the learner is not as startled emotionally in the school environment. Traumatic events create dysregulation, okay, because there's increased reactivity of a traumatic event. And the way that we can manage that as within a trauma-informed learning environment would be to create co-regulation and connection with our students. Okay. All right. We also, with a traumatic event, we do also see a reduced executive functioning because students are hypervigilant, and so their linear thinking or their ability to plan and process becomes dysregulated. And that's an opportunity for us to have very scaffolded tasks so that we're actually creating like a task analysis of step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, so that we can re-regulate that linear thinking, okay? And this is very important, traumatic events disrupt memory, okay? Even though they're highly emotional, you remember the traumatic event, but you have inconsistent recall of the actual curriculum because you're so focused on the traumatic event. So in those instances, it is important for us, if we know that a student is having a traumatic event or is prone to a traumatic event in classrooms, to have repetition, okay, and multimodal learning, so that we're presenting the learning in multiple different modalities as repetition, hence universal design for learning. Okay? That way the memory is more enforced. Okay. So when we talk about multimodalities, definitely art integration is a fantastic one of those modalities, one of those universal designs. Okay. And another word for art integration is what we call neuroaesthetics. So what is neuroaesthetics? Okay. Neuroaesthetics is how our brain responds to art and the aesthetic experience. That's what the term neuroaesthetics means. So when we're engaged in an art experience, either viewing art or creating art, our brain is integrating emotion, attention, and cognition. So all of these are areas of activation in our brains, in the prefrontal cortex, the limbic system, and the mirror neurons. And this supports engagement, empathy, regulation. It also supports inquiry. Learners start to get very curious, okay? And self-expression. So the way our brains are engaged when we're either viewing art or engaged in art is our emotional centers are being activated, our attention centers are being activated, and our cognition is being activated. And it's supporting the experience of empathy, inquiry, engagement, regulation also, because you center and focus, and also self-expression. Okay. So social emotional learning and art go really hand in hand. This neuroaesthetic engagement is very helpful for the learning process. Our prefrontal cortex gets activated in the art experience, and we start to think about design and creation, okay? Which also encourages thinking about self-awareness and self-management as we're engaging within art, okay? Our limbic system is where our emotions are processed. In the art experience, we definitely have lots of story about the art experience for ourselves, but also for our social awareness. Okay. Mirror neurons are activated in the art experience, okay, which encourages us to have a certain sense of relatedness and identity when we're experiencing art, which supports relationship skills in social emotional learning. And then that reticular activating system, as we talked about before, that bundle of nerves that is going to focus our attention, is engaged when we are either viewing or creating art, which creates a certain sense of novelty and attention, which supports learners and ourselves to start thinking about responsible decision making as we are really identifying what's important to us or where our attention is focused through the art experience. What is it about this particular art experience that's unique for me, really focuses that attention on a level of novelty, which then creates an opportunity to practice understanding certain decisions and how they're made within our own lives and learning. So, art integration in practice activates multiple brain systems. It strengthens memory pathways and it actually supports executive functioning, which is our planning and linear thinking. Okay. So if we consider art integration in the context of social emotional learning as well as trauma-informed practices, we're thinking of it not as extra, like, we're going to create art projects as extracurricular, but actually we're exploring how do we actually embed art into curriculum as frequently or as often as possible to support rigor because it activates these multiple brain systems, it strengthens our memory, and it supports executive functioning. Okay. Here's an example of how art can be integrated into uh, curriculums such as math and science that activates all of those different brain centers and all of those different systems. This is the famous artist Calder, who is famous for the mobiles that are these brilliant mobiles at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. The balancing mobiles. I'm not going to click on this, but you have access to this lesson. In this lesson, students explore the art of Calder's balancing mobiles to understand more about science and math, and they build you are able in the lesson for the students to engage in building their own mobiles, okay, and using that as an engaging interactive opportunity for them to understand these science and math concepts as well as engagement and all of the practices that occur socially when engaging in art. Okay. And it's an example of how you can have a very rigorous math and a very rigorous science lesson that includes art. And you could also incorporate English language arts and even history into the lesson. So we're integrating all of these different areas of curriculum. And so we ask ourselves, why is art so important in exploring ways to bring it into the curriculums across all subject areas? And that's because there's a book and there's lots of research about your brain on art and how our brains actually open up and light up in terms of the systems of activation to really become engaged with art. And when we embed that within our curriculum, our learners have a much deeper emotional response to the curriculum that may seem less interesting or when practiced in a more traditional context. When we infuse art within it, then the curriculum comes to life and there's much more of an emotional response. And we know that when there is a larger emotional response, it has a much stronger impact on memory. Okay. The art also pulls into the different curriculums and disciplines a sense of community and cultural relatedness. There's opportunity to explore these areas and access to in-depth inner and intra-discourse within the individual learner. The individual learner, as they're engaging, whether they're viewing, whether they're creating, designing art with their colleagues, with their peers, they're engaging in their own inner discussion and discourse about access themselves to the curriculum, to the material, to the cultural environment that's around them. There's an acute sense of awareness that becomes more active with the learner when we infuse art into our curriculums and we create what we call relational frames. Mhm. Okay. Okay. So relational frames, as I said that I do have a background in behavioral science, there's a link here for you to learn to explore a little bit more about what relational frame theory is. Okay. All right. So very briefly, if we ask, what is this concept called relational frame theory and how is it relevant to the discussion that we're having about social emotional learning, trauma-informed practices, okay, and art integration? From a behavioral perspective, relational frame theory is a behavioral science understanding of how we learn and create meaning through language. So, for instance, if we were to teach this young person the word cookie and biscuit, right, are the same thing, as we know, we can create what we call an equivalence relation, where the word cookie also equals the word biscuit. This is just a visual that explains that, okay? Um, because we have relational frames and connections through language with how we are understanding the world around us. The same concepts also can occur, for instance, if a young person has an adverse experience on a boat and they become very nauseous and have seasickness, they may not have ever heard of the word car ferry or even been on a car ferry or may not know that word. But when we introduce the word car ferry to them, and we explain that that's the same as a boat, just having the student telling the student that, oh, we're going to go on a car ferry, they're going to automatically have that same sense of nausea that they had on a boat, because they're they're creating what we call an equivalence relation between the word boat and car ferry, even though they have not heard the word car ferry before. So how is that relevant to our conversation that we're having now? Because we're starting to understand how important language and images are in connecting to and creating meaning. Language shapes meaning. So you could imagine that there's an image is kind of like an icon for experience. Language is like a symbol, or it's symbolic for a meaning. Okay. And these relational networks are very important. For instance, in the school setting, let's say, for instance, relational networks carry emotion. Words, images, and memories link together. For instance, a test that could have an experience of failure is linked to anxiety. And there's a transformative function here. So, for instance, in a neutral classroom events can trigger this distress, right? A quiz can cause anxiety because it's linked to a past adversarial experience. And these responses spread across and beyond the original event. For instance, the fear extends from a quiz to a test, to speaking in class, or being called on. Okay. These relational frames that are occurring in language and also images for our learners. These are called relational networks in a behavioral science concepts called relational frame theory. So these relational networks can create an internal dialogue for our students, such as, I'm not good at school, based on, one experience of maybe starting from a quiz or a test. So this is how these relational networks are occurring in language and in experience for our students. And you could understand that these are stored in language, and they're stored in memory, and they're stored in emotion, these experiences. And these are called relational frame theories. Okay. It's a meaning-making experience. The individual repertoire shapes the context of that experience. It links language as labels, and the language shapes how learning and thinking happens, which is cognition. Okay. But beyond language, art, and relational frame theory, relational frames are most rigorously demonstrated through language. However, relations don't have to be in words. We can use art, okay, to create emotional salience, where learners relate experiences through artistic expression, and meaning emerges through relational networks experienced through art. So we can use art um, to support our students to create new relational frames for experiences that they have had that have been adverse. We can create new relational frames by encouraging more opportunities to have art within our classrooms, to activate all of the systems of learning that we have been discussing. Okay. Because art and meaning making, art can become meaning making for our students. In the process or the experience of art, what happens is we're creating and we're expressing. For relational frame theory, there's a symbolic formation that's occurring through that process and the outcome is engagement. Emotionally, if we're having an experience through art, we're having a feeling and we're attending to the art. In terms of relational frame theory, meaning gets attached to that process and it reinforces memory. In the process of engaging with art, we're framing a sense of inquiry and wonder. What's happening is we might be comparing and contrasting thoughts within our experience of art. With relational frame theory, relations are formed through that comparing and contrasting of the art experience and inquiry. And the outcome is that we have new perspectives of things. Even if we're critiquing art, okay, we're connecting it to our own sense of self and our understanding of the world, which is building networks of relational frames and identity awareness. So the engagement of art definitely encourages learners to create relational frames with outcomes that can be very uh, beneficial to the development of the learner. Okay. Particularly in the areas of social emotional learning. For self-awareness and self-management, we link these emotions and experience in relational frame theory, and we start to understand that we have individual contextual understandings of things, okay? As we're teaching students to understand and learn more about art, we are linking emotions and experience to individual contextual understanding, which supports self-awareness and management. Okay. As we're engaging in art, there's also a strong sense of social awareness as we're understanding the contextualized responses and processes that occur in the art, as well as social emotional learning and relational frame theory. And the same thing with relationship skills. There's perspective taking that is happening, and there's responsible decision making, linking these actions together. Okay. And if we look at the various different curriculums, we can see that, for instance, in math, the prefrontal cortex is the brain region that's occurring. If you pull in the art, we can pull in different patterns and visuals. And for relational frame theory, there's symbolic relations that are occurring within those patterns and symbols. Okay. For literacy, there's Broca's area of the brain, which can, if with for an art hook, we have story and imagery, which enhances perspective taking. For history, the regions of the brain are the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. And the art hook would be looking at like artifacts of history. And the relational frame thinking process is kind of considering time and value and comparisons. And for science, it's the prefrontal cortex also. We're looking at models and we're looking at cause and effect. Mhm. So, social emotional learning, this level of the integrated framework includes it, continuing to engage in social emotional learning practices within our school setting, but also taking into account as we're doing that trauma informed practices that create these conditions for safety and regulation. Okay. And we're integrating art or neuroaesthetics because it engages the brain through emotion and embodiment. And this also concept, if it's new for you, called relational frame theory, which explains how language and experience become meaning and identity. Mhm. Okay. And I'm a little early. It's
Yes.
11:13. Okay.
What a wonderful presentation. I'm going to drop a link to the agenda just in case you all need it, but I'm also going to drop a link to our conference survey so you have that accessible to you. I believe the lunchtime special is about to launch, and so you enjoy your lunch and enjoy that presentation, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to our ASL Spanish interpreters. Thank you, Dr. Gamora. Thank you, VFairs. Thank you, everyone on this call, and have a wonderful day at the conference.